couple of weeks ago, we began this series called The Bible Behind Bars, really taking a look at some of the stories of people who are imprisoned or held captive throughout Scripture. Last time, a couple of weeks ago, we started with the story of the Hebrew slaves who were captives in Egypt and their escape out into the wilderness. And I don't know if you recall how that story began, the story of the Hebrew slaves. It began with the words, "A Pharaoh rose to power who did not know Joseph," who did not remember Joseph's story. And that got me to thinking, how well do we know Joseph's story? How well do we remember Joseph? So today we're going to back up just a little bit and spend some time with the story of Joseph. And the scripture that I'm going to read actually comes very near the end of the book of Genesis. It comes near the end of Joseph's story. It's delivered as Joseph is standing before his brothers who had many years before tried to kill him and sell him into slavery into a foreign country. And at their father's death, we read these words from Genesis 50. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph saying, "Your father gave us instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father.' Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And then his brothers also wept and fell down before him and said, 'We are here as your slaves.' But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? And even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones.' And in this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them." Genesis is 50 books. For the first 35 chapters of the book of Genesis, after, reading the story of creation, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the great flood and the Tower of Babel, the story of the covenant that God makes with Abraham and Sarah, and then the story of how that covenant is renewed with their son Isaac, and then how that covenant is renewed also by God with Isaac's sons Esau and Jacob. After all of that, for 35 chapters, we come to the story of Jacob and his 12 sons, born from 4 different women. Genesis continues the story of Jacob and his 12 sons. Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, favored 2 of those sons, the sons that were born late in his life, born to his beloved Rachel. Remember the story of the Rachel for whom he had worked 14 long years tending his uncle Laban's flocks. You remember how Laban had tricked Jacob into marrying the older daughter, Leah, first, after he had worked 7 years for Rachel, and so he had to work another 7 years for the hand of Rachel, the one that he truly loved. So it is Rachel's 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, born after Jacob is late in his life, that he loved more than all of the other sons. And since Rachel died after giving birth to Benjamin, there would be no more sons from her. So he loved these 2 sons more than the other 10. And of these 2 sons, he loved Joseph the most as the eldest. So that's 35 chapters of Genesis, and then we come to the remaining 13 chapters, about a quarter of the book, and it's all about Joseph. Joseph gets a lot of ink in Genesis compared to anyone else. And so, unlike Pharaoh, it might be good for us to remember Joseph's story. And Joseph's story begins with the Bible telling us that not only was Joseph the favorite of all of Jacob's sons, but that Jacob had given Joseph this spectacular, beautiful, colorful robe. The King James Version calls it a coat. That's where we get the coat of many colors. It's a beautiful robe of many, many colors. It has full sleeves to signify Jacob's special love for his son. It also ensures that Joseph will never go out into the fields and labor like the rest of his brothers. For how could he go out and do manual work in such a beautiful robe? You can almost see Joseph's older brothers, seeing him strutting around in his beautiful robe, thinking, well, isn't Daddy's boy special? And no doubt that resentment grew. Now, Joseph didn't help matters any. He could have kept his dream to himself. He could have kept the details of his dream to himself. But being the special boy that he was, he couldn't resist goading his brothers. And he runs to them and he says, listen to the amazing dream that I had last night. We were all binding sheaves out in the field. And you know what happened? Suddenly, my sheaf stood upright in the center. And all of your sheaves gathered around my sheaf and bowed down to it. Huh? What do you think of my dream? Well, you know what they thought of his dream. And so then and there, Joseph's brothers begin to strategize how they are going to get rid of this naughty brother of theirs. And so they literally ripped that beautiful robe off of his back. And they took him out and they threw him into a pit with no water, and they were going to just let him rot and die there. But opportunity arrived. That's kind of what happens in the story of God's people often. And this opportunity came in the form of some peddlers from Midian that are traveling through. And the brothers decided maybe they could make a little bit off of this brother of theirs. And so they sell Joseph to the peddlers for 20 pieces of silver. And with that, these Midian salesmen, they pull Joseph out of the pit and they haul him with all the rest of their wares to Egypt, where they hope that they'll be able to turn a profit by selling him into slavery. And the brothers took that robe, a beautiful robe, and they ripped it and shredded it, and they poured goat's blood on it, and they took it back to their old father, and they told the old man that his precious, precious boy had been devoured by wild animals. And Jacob was distraught, so much so the Bible says he could not be comforted. And Jacob believes now he has only one son left. Forget these other 10. All of his love, all of his devotion now falls upon little Benjamin, the youngest son of his beloved Rachel. Now meanwhile, back in Egypt, Joseph is sold into slavery, and he is sold to the captain of the Egyptian army called Potiphar. You ever heard of Potiphar? Well, the Bible says Joseph was a good-looking young man. I mean, actually, it just says that he was better looking than all the rest. And, Potiphar's wife took notice and tried to arrange a tryst with this young Hebrew that her husband had brought into the house. But Joseph rebukes her and refuses her advances, and this makes Potiphar's wife incensed, and she makes all sorts of accusations against him. And so Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison, where he is to spend the rest of his life, behind bars. And so Joseph is there in prison, and it's there in prison where his story really begins to take shape. He becomes a trustee of sorts, because he was well liked by the chief jailer, and so after some time, the chief jailer decided to put Joseph in a position of authority over some of the other prisoners. And a couple of years go by, and there are these two servants of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the baker for the king and the cupbearer for the king. They do something, they fall out of sorts with the king, and so the king has them thrown into prison, and when you know it, they're thrown into the same prison where Joseph is. Joseph becomes the one who is in charge of their care. Now this baker and this cupbearer of the king, they're having terrible nightmares at night, dreams that keep them awake, and they just can't sort all of these dreams out. And Joseph says, well, you know, ever since I was a boy, I kind of had a thing with dreams. He said, maybe I can tell you what your dreams are about. So they tell Joseph their dreams, and Joseph interprets their dreams back to the baker and the cupbearer. And when you know it, those dreams come true, just as Joseph foretold that they would, which turns out pretty well for the cupbearer, who is released from prison and goes back into service for the king. But let's just say it doesn't work out so well for the baker, who loses his head. So another couple of years pass by, and Joseph is still in prison, when Pharaoh himself begins to have troubling dreams that keep him awake at night. And Pharaoh is disturbed by his dreams. He can't figure out what his dreams mean, and his cupbearer says, hey, you know, I knew this fellow when I was in lockup. He could interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh says, go get him, and sends for Joseph, and Joseph comes, hears Pharaoh's dreams, and tells Pharaoh what his dreams mean. Says, your dreams mean that there is a terrible famine that is going to come all over the land. But before this famine comes, there's going to be 7 years of great abundance. And that'll be followed by 7 years of the worst famine you've ever seen. And so then Joseph suggested to Pharaoh that, you know, you probably ought to put someone in charge of laying up some provisions, of storing up some grain during these 7 really great years, so that you'll have something that will carry you through as a reserve for those 7 years of famine. And wouldn't you know it, the right man for the job is right there under Pharaoh's nose. He is so impressed with this young man who tells him what his dreams mean and then suggests that they should lay up provisions through the abundant years, that Pharaoh puts a ring on Joseph's finger, dresses him like a good proper official of Pharaoh's court, and puts cuffs on him that suggests that he is a man of authority and power. And at the age of 30 years old, Joseph, an ex-convict who had once been sold into slavery, accused of doing improper things with an army colonel's wife, becomes now the second in command over all of Egypt, answering only to Pharaoh. And Joseph did his job well. He stored up so much grain during these 7 plenteous years that not only was there enough grain for Egypt to carry them through the famine, but there was abundantly more, so much more that people would come from all over the world to purchase grain from Egypt because the famine had fallen all over the land. And wouldn't you know it, in one of the greatest plot twists of all the Bible, some of those who come to buy grain from Joseph are his 10 brothers sent by their father Jacob. They don't recognize him, but he sure knows who they are. And Joseph can't help. He just can't help himself to play some games with them, since they don't recognize him in an Egyptian tunic and gold chains and cuffs of the official of the palace. And so Joseph says, I don't think all of your family is here. I think there is another brother. Of course he knew there was another brother. He said, why don't you go back and get your youngest brother, and when you return with him, then I'll be ready to deal with you about purchasing grain. And so the brothers go back to get their younger brother. And old Jacob, the old man, can't you imagine how distraught he is about the idea of sending this last precious son of Rachel with them? But the brothers plead, and they say, there's no way. We will not be able to buy grain unless we take Benjamin with us. This official has the power of divination. He knows this brother exists. We have to take him with us. And finally, old Jacob relents. But they promise nothing. Absolutely nothing will happen to this boy. Nothing is going to happen to him. And so they return, pulling little Benjamin along. And Joseph then conspires to frame his brothers for theft. Puts a silver cup in little Benjamin's bag and then has an official stop them, search them. They find the cup and make accusations. They're hauled back into the court before Joseph. And Joseph says, for stealing the cup, then I will keep Benjamin as a hostage. And the brothers are just broken. They know what that will do to their father, and they plead with Joseph, please, please don't do this. This boy, you have no idea what he means to his father. If we go back, if we return, I don't care how much grain we're able to buy, if we go back without this boy, it will kill him. It will kill the old man. And they beg for Benjamin's life. They say, take one of us. Let one of us be instead of Benjamin. Let Benjamin return to his father. And Joseph can't keep up the ruse any longer. And he begins to weep. And he cannot hide his identity anymore. And he weeps and he falls into the arms of his surprised brothers. And he says, you don't recognize me. It's me. It's me, Joseph, the one that you had thrown into the cistern and sold into slavery. The brothers are astounded. They cannot believe their eyes. Joseph says, go get our father. Go get Jacob and bring him here to Egypt, and we will all have plenty. We will all have more than enough here until the famine is over. And he sends the brothers home, taking with them Joseph's gifts of garments and grain and silver. And they go and they tell Jacob, Joseph is alive. We have seen him. Joseph is alive. And old Jacob cannot believe his ears, and he is overjoyed. And he says, then take me to him. Take me to my son, that I might be able to see him before I die. And so Joseph settles his whole family there in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. And they remain there. They remain there all the years of Jacob's life until the old man dies. And upon their father's death, the brothers become very anxious. What if, now that the old man's dead, what if Joseph bears a grudge against us and seeks revenge to pay us back for all of the wrong that we did to him? And so they go to beg Joseph's forgiveness. They said, our father before we died said that we should come and beg for your forgiveness. And that's when we read these words that I started with this morning from Genesis. They beg Joseph to forgive them, and Joseph says to them, weeping, he says, am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, can't you see how God intended it for good? What powerful words. Even though you intended it for harm for me, God meant it for good. God sought to work something good out of it. I think Joseph comes to understand what I've seen others come to know, even some who have endured some very difficult circumstances in their lives, maybe even people who perhaps find themselves sitting in a jail cell, or who have been betrayed or done wrong by people close to them. It's easy to reflect on such situations and wonder, why, Lord? Why should such terrible things happen to me? Why should such terrible things happen to people that I love? But Joseph Joseph does something different. From the advantage of a different time, from the advantage of a different station, a different place in his life, Joseph cannot be bitter. Because he sees the hand of God that has worked in even the worst circumstances of his own life. And with that, he can forgive his brothers. Because what they intended for harm, Joseph knows God had worked good even out of that. Has there ever been a time for you when you've been able to look back at the past? Maybe look back at some of the most terrible times of your life and see them, though, in a different light, because you're able to view them from a different time, from a different station, from a different place in your life, where you're able to see that even in the worst circumstances of your life, God was able to work it out for good. Has that been true for any of you? I know it isn't easy to see at the time, not when you're in the midst of the pain and the difficult times, but in a moment of retrospect, looking back, it's possible, I think, to see and to acknowledge, what others intended for harm, God has meant for good. And here's why I ask that question, because if you've ever experienced that kind of insight, you have a powerful testimony to share with others who find themselves presently in the darkness and in the trials of life. You see, a witness that even in the darkest times, God might be able to work good out of it. Such a witness is a key that can unlock the prisons, unlock the cells of shame and guilt and pity that all too often imprison people. See, a witness like that can offer hope. I know that right now here, in our community, in our congregation, no doubt there are people that are experiencing some of those difficult days, some of that darkness, some of the hardest days, the days of bondage and captivity. But I also know there are others, I'm certain of it, there are others among us who have seen and can testify, who know that what others possibly have meant for harm, God has meant for good. God has worked out for good. And I'm hoping that the knowing of that might open doors and might bring about reconciliation and forgiveness. To know that God works things out for good might help us unlock the future for all of us. Meant for good, intended for good. Because, you see, the nature of God cannot do any other than good. The nature of God, it's always meant for good. Thanks be to God. Next week, I hope you'll return. Next week, we're going to continue this series with the unfortunate imprisonment of John the Baptist. And that story is less about John than it is about Herod Antipas. So I hope you'll be back with us next week. Let's stand as we prepare to sing our final.